live. We are now live. How's everybody doing today? I appreciate y'all for joining me on this Sunday. I always tell myself to do all this writing stuff before I hit the go live button. I never do it, so I apologize for that. Today on Quality Time, we're going to talk to the author of When Crack Was King, A People's History of a Misunderstood Era. Donovan Ramsey is the author of this book. Now, we always start off all the Quality Times the same way. We talk about what book that I'm reading now and what book am I looking to get into when I finish. I just finished The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference. This was a great book. I recommend it for everybody, entrepreneurs, anybody who wants to kind of look at the way things work, how big trends follow a series of small instances and small, occurrences. So this was a really good book. I enjoyed it. I came across this book because I'm a big The Roots fan, big Black Thought fan. And I remember an old interview where Black Thought said that most of his books, or most of his albums were named after books, and The Tipping Point was one of them. Now, fast forward a few years, I'm watching Bel Air with my wife, and the main character on Bel Air was gifted The Tipping Point by somebody, and that just kind of jogged my memory. So that night, I ordered the book, and that's how I read it, which was a series of small instances that made me read it. Another book that I am reading right now, in addition to When Crack Was King, is Getting on Code by my man Aaron Maben. I've been reading this for a while. The reason why it's taking me so long is because every time I read a chapter, I bother Aaron with a question about the book. So that's why it's taking me so long to read this one, because this is really like a research for me, because Aaron is a voice that is very welcomed into our community, and he's a mind that I think is a real leader when it comes to the new kind of generation of revolutionary thinkers and leaders. I think that he's somebody who is very important to our community at right now. So being able to kind of bounce ideas off of him is something that I'm really cherishing and I'm happy about. So that's the reason it's taking me so long to read it. But it's a great book. I read pages over and over again on this book. So Getting on Code is a book I'm reading now. Also, I've fallen in love with reading multiple books at the same time. Y'all made fun of me for not doing it before, so now that I'm doing it, The Psychology of Self-Hatred and Self-Defeat Towards a Reclamation of the African Mind by Amos Wilson is another book that I'm reading right now. And these all kind of fall into each other. Another book that I'm kind of flipping through is Who Dropped the Ball on Our Kids? The Continuing Miseducation of Black Youth and Its Negative Effect on Their Identity Formation and Economic Power. That's a book I'm going to read next. I have two kids that are in school. School's about to start back up, and I want to read about the shortcomings that happen in my time and what's happening in the future in ways that I can fill in those gaps. Continue depending on the public school system to carry all of the burden to educate our kids is really a lesson in insanity, in my opinion. So we have to find out where we can fill those gaps in and where we can help our children excel. So that's what I'm reading right now. And of course, in addition to When Crack Was King. And we're going to bring the author of When Crack Was King, Donovan Ramsey, on so we can talk a little bit more about this amazing book. Am I yelling? Y'all let me know if I'm yelling. I'm sorry. Y'all let me know if I'm yelling a little bit. Excuse my clearing of my throat here. Mr.
Hey, what's going on?
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. It's Sunday. You can't complain on a Sunday. So
Absolutely.
I won't start. I appreciate you for joining me today. Now I have heard about you for a while, but anybody who's watching that may not have heard about you, if you don't mind giving like an introduction to yourself.
Sure. I'm Donovan. I'm a journalist, now an author. I've written about Black America, Black experiences in America throughout my entire career, for places like the LA Times, the New York Times, the Atlantic. And right now, I have this book out, When Crack Was King, that is sort of a cornerstone on a lot of the work that I've done looking at Black people, our experiences in this country, patterns of power in this country, and how they affect our lives.
All right. Now I will say before we get into the questions that you shot some holes in one of my main conspiracy theories with this book, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the book, When Crack Was King, A People's History of a Misunderstood Era. What do you think is the biggest misconception of the crack era?
I would start with one simple, which is that I think most people don't even know what crack is. And out of this misunderstanding of the fact that crack is the same chemical substance as powder cocaine, you get like a whole avalanche of myths. So you get the myth of the crack baby, you get the myth of the super predator, you get the myth of the crackhead, all of these things that were used to dehumanize mainly Black people come from this idea that crack was a super substance that then sort of infected anybody that touched it.
So from the beginning of the book, it's very obvious that a lot of research went into writing this book, putting this together. So if you don't mind, kind of talk to me about some of the research process that you went through while putting it together.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you for that. It's good to know that people can like feel how much time I put into it. But I would say that the research starts with just my own upbringing, growing up in a neighborhood that was hard hit by crack, and having family members that got swept up, in that epidemic during that era. And that I would say is where lots of the questions started for me. So, I write about my neighbor Michelle, who lived down the street, who I never really got to meet, but I would experience her through the music that she played at night. And I experienced her through the complaints that, the women in my neighborhood had about the people that were coming in and out, of Michelle's house, and, all the activity that surrounded it, in the way that it made our lives a little bit, dangerous. And I write about Michelle, but there are of course other stories, from my upbringing that made me seriously question what was going on in my community. But the research really around the book specifically started in earnest in about 2018 when I traveled the country for about a year to all of the hardest hit neighborhoods, and I interviewed people who survived the crack epidemic from all different perspectives. And during the course of that research and interviewing, also doing a ton of reading of news from that time and studies and reports about exactly how it happened. And and that's how the book came together.
Okay. Now, I wanted to speak about the interviewing. The first thing that I said to my wife when I started reading it is how the research jumped off the page, right?
Mm-hmm.
You could feel the amount of hours that were spent reading, interviewing people, and the amount of work that you put into this book. And I appreciate that because, I'm an 80s baby like yourself. So we saw the effects of a lot of the crack era, right? We saw the direct harm that was done. And this book was able to fully kind of bring everything full circle for me personally. And I appreciate that. Now, you talk about your interviewing of people that were hit by the crack era, and you decided to focus on a few people that you interviewed. How many people in total do you know that you interviewed, and how did you decide who to focus on for the book?
Yeah, it was, honestly, hundreds of people that I interviewed for the book. And we're talking, recovering addicts, we're talking politicians, police officers, prosecutors, drug dealers, of course, but also a lot of people who just loved people who struggled with addiction. So children and spouses and parents. And it was hard to pick the 4 people that I wanted to focus on. Originally, I wanted each chapter to be a different person and for it to be a different city. So I was going to do 10 cities, 10 people, and that would be the book. But I realized that I wanted the reader to spend more time with each person. That it wasn't that what's missing from how Black history is told is that we often don't get to see its impact of these sort of phenomenon on the lives of the people who experience it. So I knew that I needed to go deep, and that meant that I needed to tell fewer stories. Ultimately, I tell the story of Lenny Woodley, a woman that was addicted to crack for a few decades out of South Central LA, Kurt Schmoke, who was the mayor of Baltimore throughout that city's crack epidemic, Sean McCrae, who was a dealer out of Hayes Homes in Newark, New Jersey, and Elgin Swift, whose father was an addict, and Elgin was a dealer as well. And, you know, one, they were in cities that I thought were important to the story, but they also represented, I thought, together that they could sort of paint a picture of how the epidemic played out based on all the different experiences. And finally, I would say that those 4 people were just really open. It is hard to get people to open up about often what is like the hardest stuff that they experience. So, you know, they, I think, trusted me enough to take care of their stories and were willing to tell me.
Yeah. And, you know, you spoke of their stories with a certain, you know, compassion and empathy that was able, that I think they probably felt when you interviewed them, that made them trust you that much more, because you didn't speak down on anybody in the book is another thing that jumped off, that you were explaining everything. You know, you didn't speak with shame or pity about anybody. You spoke with complete honesty and truth.
Thanks, man. I mean, you know, like for me, it starts with some of my like earliest memories, like I said, of that neighbor Michelle of mine, who I have this this memory of being on my front porch in Ohio, in Columbus, and you know, I never met this lady, but I knew what she looked like. I would see her in passing, and one day this van pulled up, and an older woman got out who kind of looked like Michelle a little bit, and then a young girl got out who kind of looked like Michelle a little bit, and they went to her house, and I asked my older sister, you know, who do you think those people are? And she was like, you know, that's probably Michelle's family. And, you know, I'm like 5, right? But it hit me, this realization that, wow, this person that we know is a crackhead in our neighborhood, you know, that's what we called her, has a family. You know, she has a mom just like me. She has a daughter, you know, and she lives just down the street from us. So
Right.
I think that has always gone into how I've written about our community, right? Is that these people are me, that I actually have more in common with these people than I do with the Elon Musk and even the Barack Obamas of the world, you know, so I use we a lot in the book, and talking about Black communities, I say we experience this because it does feel just that close to me.
Yeah, it definitely does. And, you know, you being from Columbus, Ohio, I'm from the Midwest as well. A lot of the focus on the crack epidemic were the 2 coasts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the 3 coasts, really, New York, LA, Miami. How did your experience, your personal experiences, how did those kind of differ from some of the people that you interviewed in those big cities as far as the era?
You know, I like really wanted to tell the story of crack in the Midwest. It just, you know, I wasn't able to find somebody that kind of fully encompassed a lot of the ideas that I wanted to explore. So that's why I did write myself into the book. You know, crack hit the Midwest, the epidemic hit the Midwest later than it did the coast, right? So crack starts in the West Coast and then spreads very quickly to the East Coast in the early 80s. But because things, you know, get to the Midwest a little bit later, our crack epidemic came later, like really like mid to late 80s, but then it lasted longer into the 90s. So when people from the Midwest talk about the crack epidemic, we're also talking about the early 90s, whereas it was already sort of on its way out in the bigger cities. And there are so many interesting stories about crack in the Midwest. I mean, you have, you know, the Chambers brothers out of Detroit. You have even the Black Mafia family, you know, has its beginnings in the Midwest and then goes to Atlanta and kind of explodes from there. There are some really interesting stories too about how Chicago's crack epidemic was short-lived because the sort of gang system in Chicago shut it down a lot more earlier than it did in LA, that there were already established drug trades and that they just weren't as interested in moving into crack as the sort of younger dealers in LA were. So for that reason, Chicago didn't have a crack epidemic like cities like LA, despite the fact that they have like a robust distribution network through gangs. You know, but you know, to your point, I think that the stories of Black folks in the Midwest are often overlooked, but they're really important to understanding, I think, the character of Black people in this country, because we are kind of quintessential, you know, Southern stories. Then we relocated during the Great Migration to these places, often for jobs. Like, you know, in my family, it's all industrial, you know, car people and coal miners, and you know, that's what they left the South for. And then you know, the communities that we still live in are really Black. You know, like I mean, it don't get no Blacker than Chicago and Gary, Indiana, and Cleveland, and you know, St. Louis. Where are you from?
I was born in Indianapolis. I've lived in Gary, and my dad still lives in Evansville.
Oh wow, yeah, that's Midwest for real.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Like, you know, I remember when, like you said, the crack era hit the Midwest a little later and stayed a little longer.
Yeah.
I remember anything that came from New York or California had a little more level of importance to Indiana, right? So somebody knew something. It could be anything, a movie, piece of clothing, or a drug, right? Any of that they said, well, this is from New York. Instantly, somebody would give it credence, and they would, you know, try it out.
Yeah.
And when I tell people that I lived in Gary, they're like, oh, that's where Michael Jackson's from. I'm like, that's before the crack hit. Once when crack hit, it was like an A bomb. You know what I mean? And I can only imagine how those experiences translated to the quote unquote bigger cities. But like you said, a lot of times, you know, in the Midwest, we're kind of forgotten about because we have bits of stories from each different major city, right? We have a bit of a story. Somebody came from LA and did this. Somebody came from New York and left this here. Somebody came up from down south. And then all of that is kind of like a melting pot in the Midwest. And those effects, they're still felt.
Absolutely. I was actually in Chicago when I was reporting the book, and I spent some time in Gary, and really, you know, I have a soft space in my heart for Gary because Gary is a quintessential industrial Black town, right? That Gary is founded by a steel company, by U.S. Steel. So its entire purpose is for people to work in the steel industry. But when you have something like deindustrialization in the 70s, then that means that all of those jobs go away. Yep. So what had been thriving middle class or working class Black communities can only become ghettos because there is no other way for people to make money. And when you think about the position that puts folks in, people left their homes. You know, people left all of their family and their support network and everything that kept them alive to go to these places for opportunity, to have that snatched away in a generation. So that's how something like crack comes into our communities. It's, you know, it's not a coincidence that the cities that crack hit the hardest were these great migration cities, because you're talking about people who have been removed from, being able to grow a garden, beside their house for food, people who have been removed from the businesses that they may have had back home, but also that have been removed from community. And they are now in this strange place, in this strange land without the opportunity that they moved there for. Crack becomes really attractive to folks in terms of something to use to feel better, but it also becomes really attractive as a way to make money.
To make them, yep.
If your dad worked for US Steel and he could, guarantee that he would be able to buy a house, buy a car, send his kids off to college, retire, and then his son is looking, saying, "What's for me? How do I get my piece of the pie?" Crack is tailor made for that moment.
Yep. And I remember when one of the steel mills in Gary closed down, and it was two major, steel mills in the town, and that's where you worked. That's where your dad worked, that's where you worked, where your son and daughter might work, and then one closed down, so that's 50% of the income. And like you said, that moment of desperation, that is tailor-made for something like a crack epidemic.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That moment of desperation, of isolation, and you've moved your family from Mississippi, Alabama, wherever you were from. You can't go back to grandma's house. You can't go to your uncle's house and do this and that and the third. So now you have to figure it out. And some people figure it out in different ways.
Absolutely. I got a quick question for you. Have you ever been to Bilko's barbershop?
No.
Okay.
No.
So Bilko's is a barbershop in Gary that one day I will write about, because I find it to be so interesting that it is the home of the barber guide. So when you're in the barbershop and you see that like style guide of all those guys, there's like a classic one.
Yeah.
That was actually photographed at Bilko's, because a guy that got his hair cut there worked for the Wall Clipper Company in Chicago. So when they wanted to make promotional stuff, he was like, "Y'all should come to my barbershop and, just take some pictures of the guys with the cut." So Gary's influential in this way that we don't know, which is they have influenced haircuts around Black America from that one style guide.
Yeah. I mean, that's like you said, and I'm sure not enough people in Gary know about that to where that can be a sense of pride. You know what I mean? There's not that much.
You're right.
In Gary, there's a sense of abandonment. You know what I mean? There's a sense of, if somebody does make it from here, they're just going to move, and they're going to leave, and they're never going to come back. And you can feel it wherever you go.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Now, one thing you did with this book that I thought was really ingenious is that you started it off, and I don't want to give anybody, the whole book, but you started it off with very personal information about the people that you interviewed. And then you immediately turned to a macro vision of the quote unquote war on drugs. Chapter 5 is probably one of my favorite chapters of a book that I've read in a very long time, because you go into amazing detail about what framework went around the quote unquote war on drugs. Was that chapter sequencing, was that done intentionally, and kind of what all went into, I'm sure it was done intentionally, but what all went into deciding to do that?
Yeah, it was tough. And I really debated with my editor a lot about how we were going to structure the book, because I knew that that the history, that the sort of setting up the background of everything that came before was very important to me in my research. That I, having been born in the 80s, I needed to know what my community was before crack. And you cannot feel the loss and the impact of crack if people don't have that understanding first. So, folks that were there and that experienced it now were grown, may know, but not those of us that sort of grew up in it, not to mention these young kids, right? So, so I knew that I would have to sort of set that, paint that picture. But then we got into the piece, sort of the question of, well, it's a book about the crack epidemic, but crack doesn't show up until about 100 pages in. So how do you, solve for that? And what I realized is that I could start with putting the characters in the present day, and that you could actually get into the book more easily if you're able to meet them as they are now, right? And see them as survivors. And, I thought about superheroes. I thought about, every superhero, you eventually get their origin story. So I wanted to write about these four individuals as these superheroes who survived the crack epidemic. So you place them in today, and then you give them the origin story. And that was kind of how the sequencing, came. It was understanding that the story needed to mostly move chronologically because there's a lot of moving pieces. So you kind of simplify it by putting it in chronological order. But that I wanted to definitely have readers meet me and then go with me as I met these four people. And then almost like a dream sequence, like a flashback, take you to, the sort of beginning of where crack came from. Now which chapter is chapter 5? I kind of forget.
Chapter 5 is when you talk about like President Johnson,
Yes.
and then leading into Nixon, and how I remember reading on Huey P. Newton book about how the president wanted to separate anti-war people and Black Panthers and to isolate them, and then this book kind of gave the full explanation of it. You know what I mean? And you quoted cabinet members. And I remember running upstairs and telling my wife, like, the thing about weed being a gateway drug was a freestyle. That was just
Yep.
That was just really good. And I remember that just being beaten to our heads so much, as youth. And it explains, chapter 5 kind of explains the power of media, really, and how when you introduce the book, you introduce individuals as people. Which sounds crazy, but you don't introduce them as statistics. When you look at the crack era, a lot of times you can look at it as a statistic, or as just these are crackheads. Like, these weren't people before they experiment with drugs. They're not people during their experimentation, and there's people on the back end as well. If you could just put a blanket over them and just call everybody crackheads, then it takes some of that empathy away, and some of that humanity away, and understanding away from really seeing what's going on.
Absolutely. And for me, it's like, that's what I feel like happens to us as Black folks in media and in the ways that, how do I want to say it? So like, I've been a journalist for over a decade now. I went to Columbia Journalism School, so I learned from some of the finest journalists. I've reported at, some really well-respected outlets, and they don't do our stories justice because they, by nature, the way that storytelling is done is reductive. And so many of the things that impact us as Black people, right, like, needs to be complicated. You have to add layers of understanding onto things. And, when I say that this book is sort of a cornerstone on a lot of my reporting, I don't just mean the subject matter. I mean, I learned to be a storyteller so I could write this book. And I actually had to turn back to a lot of the techniques that I had just naturally growing up in a Black community among storytellers, right? And that's that, we'll tell you a story, right? We'll like get into something, and then we'll say something like, but quiet as it's kept, which means that we're about to give you a lot of context. Or we'll say, mind you, or truth be told. And what that is that is us signaling that we're about to give you a lot of information that'll make whatever we just described make sense. That we will give context and meaning to what it was we just said. That's what the book, is really trying to do, is to say, here are these four people, here's what they went through, but quiet as it's kept. You know what I mean?
Right.
And as loud as it is, all of this information then like helps you understand more. So, that kind of, in talking about, right, like describing somebody as just a crackhead, or thinking of a drug dealer as a super predator, or somebody whose parents use drugs as a crack baby. I mean, yeah, you could do that, and that is a way of telling a story, but there has to be more, and that, like, these people live among us. They often are us, and their lives are also connected to ours. So how do we fill in those gaps? How do we, make it make sense, so to speak?
Right. And the the first couple of pages of the book really took me back to a time when I was in Americus, Georgia, in college, and it reminded me of a story when, because like I said, I was growing up. It was just, this person over here is a crackhead, your uncle is a drug addict, and there's no explanation that comes with that. It's just, don't be like them,
Yeah.
go be like this. And I remember, growing up in that thinking, and I was in Americus, and every city has that guy that could have went to the NBA, could have went to the NFL. Something happened, and we had that guy in Americus, and he was washing cars. And I remember he was washing my car, and I just started talking to him like, "Hey, how'd you get hooked on dope?" And the stories that he told me were so, and it sounds crazy, but they were so just regular.
Mm-hmm.
I had this in, and then I had this problem happen. Then this issue happened. Then my dad ended up getting fired. And boom, 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 boom. And then I started experimenting with drugs. And it opened my mind, because foolishly thinking, I just thought, you just decided to be a drug addict. I didn't decide to do that. So we're not the same. And then he's telling me, like, no, these series of instances happen that can happen to anybody. They happen to me back to back to back to back. And then the experimentation happened. And the way that you tell these stories is like, these are normal people. Like you talked about Sean, like he's a normal kid growing up, and just these things happened, and then this is the outcome.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that gives you the ability, when you continue reading, is you think about Sean when you're hearing about how, this scientist in Germany developed the process to make cocaine. And you think back to Sean, you think back to Lenny, and you're like, okay, so this was a result of this.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And it makes the story just flow for me, it makes the story flow that much better, because you have personal skin in the game. Even if you're not personally in the game, you like Sean, you like Lenny. He's, mind you, your cousin. So now you're like, damn, they ain't have to do Sean like that. Why they have to, you know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Why uncles have to do this to Lenny? And it makes you care that much more, even though you should care immediately, but hearing those personal stories gives you more empathy for everything on a large scale.
Yeah. Thank you, man. That was really a goal of mine, is to, again, to show the consequences of the policy. That, I knew that just writing a history that would just be about crack's rise and fall wasn't enough. That you had to see how it actually played out in people's lives. And also, just telling the stories of people's lives isn't enough. That you need to give their lives context. Like I'm a huge fan of the 80s and 90s hood movies. I was like raised on, all of that, Clockers and Colors and Fresh. And I mean, I could just go like down like the list. And those are great movies, but they're stories of individuals that don't necessarily have the context of the way that the world is moving around them. And, this is why books are important, which is that you actually get the room and the space to explore something in depth, and people can sit and spend time with the material and make connections like that you otherwise couldn't. So yeah, I'm happy that it pays off in that way, because that was definitely the goal.
Yeah, it definitely did. And let me just clear this one thing up. I was not saying all the characters in the book are ex-drug addicts. I'm saying that everybody has a part in a world that is fueled by addiction to drugs. I just want to clear that up. I don't want to,
Yeah.
Now, one thing that you speak about in chapter 9 is, which shocked me, is Jimmy's world. Do you want to kind of go into, just not fully detailed, but kind of just some, explanation about the Jimmy's world and what happened from it?
Yeah. Isn't it amazing that people don't know this story? So,
Yeah.
I mean, I only learned it, a few years into my career as a journalist, but Jimmy's World was a story that was published by the Washington Post by a Black Metro reporter named Janet Cook. It was a story of a 9-year-old heroin addict who really, anything bad that you could imagine in Black America was happening in his life. He had a stepfather that would, shoot him up whenever, he was restless or misbehaving. He lived in a shooting gallery, is what they called them, places where people did heroin. His mom was an addict. He was the result of a incestuous relationship between his grandfather and his mother, and his life was basically hell. And Janet Cook told this story, and it was published on the front page of the Washington Post in 1980, and became a sensation. Nancy Reagan reacted to it. DC, like the government and the police department went on a search for Jimmy to find him and sort of save him from this circumstance. And it turned out that the entire thing was a complete fabrication. I should say, though, that this only came out after Janet Cook became the first Black woman to win a Pulitzer for journalism. It was then discovered that the story was fake, and she became soon after the only person to ever give a Pulitzer Prize back. And the story it came. People got excited about it. They were interested in what it said about Black people and about urban America. When it came out that it was a complete fabrication, nobody kind of said, well, wait a minute, why did we fall for this? Instead,
Right.
They just said, we shouldn't let Black people in our newsrooms the way we did Janet Cook, and then moved on quickly. But I thought it was important to include in the reporting because it should have been what made journalism more careful in the ways that it covered the crack epidemic. But instead, it sort of just became a symbol of things to come in terms of how journalism and media would treat crack.
Yeah, and that's what it reminded me of is, the sensationalism that came with the policing of the crack era, right? As we just became the symbol.
Yeah.
As Black people, we became the symbol for drugs. Every day on the news there were stories about our doors being kicked in and crack babies being taken out and women being thrown in jail. And as I got older, I remember being young and just seeing the images on TV, not knowing really what was going on. And as I got older, learning that a lot of that was media sensationalism, that was purposeful on creating this, stereotype of us, that made us, that's where the super predator comes in, and and the reason why this story was so quickly believed on a mainstream scale. You're talking about a first lady writing about this story without any fact checking, is because it's a story about Black people. Mm-hmm. And it's a story about how evil some Black people can be, and it's just accepted so quickly. You know what I mean? And I always think about, like, if that story was about somebody that did not look like me, how much fact checking would have gone in before it was pushed out to the public?
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, to that point, the executive editor of the Washington Post at the time was Bob Woodward, who was a part of the team, Woodward and Bernstein, that, broke Watergate and ultimately led to Richard Nixon's resignation. Bob Woodward knew anonymous sourcing better than anybody. He is an icon in journalism still, but he was willing to let that pass through his newsroom without checking it, without actually, you know, I mean, they even ran illustrations on the front page of the paper because they couldn't get pictures. And that, you know, didn't cause any alarms. That there were Black reporters in the newsroom that said, this is fake. That like we've
Right.
been reporting in this neighborhood for a long time. We never heard of Jimmy. That we know all of the social service workers and teachers who would have interacted with him, and we've never heard of him. This is fake. And the top editors, the white editors, chalked it up to professional jealousy. You know, they said, you know, y'all just want to be like Janet. And
Yeah.
you know, it's sad that there was so much sensationalism, because I think that the truth was troubling enough. The truth of the crack epidemic didn't need the extras. You know, we think of a show like CBS has 48 Hours. 48 Hours has its origins in the crack epidemic. It was a special that CBS put on called 48 Hours on Crack Street. And it was so popular, the first special that they did, hosted by Dan Rather, that they did Return to Crack Street. And it launched an entire series that's still on today. It's the longest running news magazine show, 48 Hours. The Reagan administration gave birth to something that I call the very special episode, which is, you know, your favorite sitcom would have one episode where one of the kids was dealing with guns or drugs or some type of violence. And that was intentional, right? That they, you know, being former actors, and Ronald Reagan was the president of, I believe, the Screen Actors Guild of the union, that they reached out to their connections in Hollywood, and they, you know, approved scripts or they disapproved scripts, that they asked them to write in episodes that would deal with drugs that included the kind of messaging that they wanted. And as a result, there was so much misinformation about the crack epidemic. And that, you know, it did scare many of us away from drugs, but it also demonized folks in our communities.
Yeah, it definitely did. Now, I read an article leading up to this interview, is that you said writing this book almost killed you.
Yeah.
What all goes into that?
It was, well, one, writing a book is hard, and I wrote this book during the pandemic. So I, you know, started reporting it in 2018. I spent, you know, a couple years doing the research and the reporting, and then I was at home through 2020 and 2021, putting the book together. And I had to listen to, you know, hours of tapes of people telling me oftentimes the worst things that ever happened to them. And, you know, I think in my life before, I had been able to kind of shrug that stuff off as a journalist, but it really started messing with me in ways that I didn't even know. You know, I would sit down to type and I would break out at full body hives, which had never happened to me before, right? I was like, why am I always so itchy, right? But it was really, I mean, I was getting hives from just the anxiety of it. And I mean, I had heart palpitations. My blood pressure was, I mean, at like dangerous levels. And it was, I think it was the material for sure, right? Like having to sort of like metabolize the information and let it kind of course through me in order to write it.
Yeah.
But it was also, it like brought up a lot of stuff about, you know, the way that I grew up, you know, growing up in a neighborhood where, you know, when you heard gunshots, you just had to get on the ground and then wait until they were done and you got back up. You know, you finish eating dinner or, you know, watching TV, whatever it was. And, you know, seeing violence in my neighborhood, you know, seeing people shot and killed, just something that I remember, yeah, when I was very, very young, you know, that happening on the street in front of my house. And how scary that was, feeling my mom's fear, you know, being a single mom, raising me and my sisters. And, you know, sometimes she would just sleep downstairs, you know, as a way of kind of keeping us safe.
Yeah.
I think that all of that was in there. And a lot of us live with that anxiety from the crack era. And we don't know it. And writing this book, it just brought it all to the surface. So for me, it was really I had to get a hold of my anxiety. That was the big thing. Just that constant nervousness that something could happen, and I needed to be ready. That came out of my childhood, and I'm much better now. Thank God.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that.
But I want all of us that lived through that experience to really investigate the ways that we carry that in our body. You know, like if you refuse to sit with your back to a door in a restaurant, you know, if you have that uneasy feeling, you know, if you check your windows and doors every night, you know, if you when you move into a new place, if you do it at nighttime because you don't want folks seeing what you're moving into your house or your apartment, like that's all crack era thinking.
Yeah.
That still lives with us, and that, you know, we have to take care of.
Yeah. And, you know, I'm very happy to hear that you're doing much better. You know, the amount of research I can only imagine would have a profound effect on the researcher,
Yeah.
you know, yourself, because you interview so many people on a personal level. You know what I mean? You're not just going through statistics in a library. You're actually in front of people.
Yeah.
You're seeing their face, you're seeing their scars, and they're telling you about their life story. And then to be able to serve as a bridge, you know, from them to the public, that's a lot of stress by itself. And you did it in a very, like I said, very empathetic, very intelligent way that is serving both the reader as well as the people that you interview.
Thanks, man. That like really means a lot. It has been tough, but it's also been very rewarding to know that this is the book that I wanted to write. It's the book that I feel like was missing from our modern history. To, you know, we hear a lot about the civil rights movement. We hear a lot about Black folks in the past, but to connect that past to the present moment, this history of the crack epidemic, I think, was necessary. So I feel it's an honor to be the person that was able to write this book.
Yeah. And, you know, I've read other books about drug usage, you know, in the Black community. It did not have this level of not have this level of research, this level of, you know, individuality. When I say that, as far as the ability to tell the different stories and how they all work with one another, you know, and it just didn't have the amount of kind of stickiness factor that this book had, because this book made me think back to like growing up, you know, being at my grandmother's house and just knowing that my uncle is in the back of the house and not knowing what he's doing. They just throw the word crack on top of it. Hey, leave him alone, you know, and just accepting that, and not even, and once that title gets thrown on somebody, the amount of humanity that just kind of vanishes from them, you know, in the eyes of a lot of people. And this book made me address that personally and just say, you know, I was wrong for doing that at such a young age. And the reason for doing that is everyone around me is growing up survivors of the crack epidemic and the crack era.
Yeah.
And when we're told that if you hear that word, flee. If if it's a rumor that somebody is dabbling in this, leave them alone for life. I mean, they can go 30 years sober, you know, and they're still an ex-drug addict in the eyes of people.
Yeah, that's one of the ugliest things about it, right? Is that it caused us to abandon our folks, and the only thing that keeps us alive as Black people is community. You know, it's like certainly not the government, but for us, the difference between life and death is somebody being willing to say, you can sleep on my couch this week or this night, or, you know, yes, I will give you $20, let you hold that, you know, for a little while. That's how we do, and this, you know, it's what we did from the very moment that we got here, as we, you know, met a stranger and said, you are my cousin now. You know, you are my aunt, or you my uncle now. And that means that we look after each other in a certain way. And what crack did, one of the saddest things about what it did to us, is it made us reluctant to do that, even within our own families, to give each other the benefit of the doubt. And I'm proud to say that we are still alive because we didn't abandon it entirely.
Mhm.
That's how we survived the epidemic. Um, is that we insisted on being a community, and we held on together long enough for the storm to pass. And now that we're on the other side of it, I hope that we are stronger in the places where we were vulnerable before, and that we will hopefully resist the uh, the feeling of wanting to check out when things get hard, and that we will resist what feels like traps that are set for us,
Right.
and especially the trap of abandoning each other.
Now, I have a couple questions off of that answer there. So, like you said, without us being able to survive as a community and not completely let go of one another, of course, right now we're going through like the opioid crisis, right? And the reporting around the opioid crisis is so much different than it was in the for the crack era. Now, let me ask you this: do you think as Black people, um, we can afford to? Because I know a lot of times we have anger. I know myself, like I have anger when I see how opioids are presented in the news as everybody's a victim and crack. It's all our fault. But one thing that this book and what you just mentioned kind of made me think of is, as Black people, can we afford to let that anger cause us to kind of turn our back to the opioid crisis, even though some of that crisis is going on in our community as well?
Yeah,
Um, can we allow, well, of course we can't allow, but how can we make sure that we don't let our anger to make it just a white problem force us to be negligent to our own community that's dealing with this as well?
yeah, that's a great question because the opioid crisis did start off as mostly a white problem, and that's because for a few reasons. One, Black people since the crack epidemic have resisted hard drugs, and we don't
Right.
use hard drugs at the same rate as white people. Black and Latino folks don't. Um, and then also too, because of anti-Black racism, doctors early on were less likely to prescribe us the kinds of opioids that, got white folks addicted, right? So like if we go in and we say we're in pain, they're like, no, you're not.
No, you're not.
black
Yeah.
black folks can't feel pain. So, take, a few ibuprofen and go home. And we weren't getting the Oxycontin, even if we were in real pain. So we were protected, so to speak, from the earliest phases of the opioid epidemic. And then once the Oxycontin and those opioids became less prevalent, then you started seeing other opioids like heroin become popular, really among that first wave of opioid addicts because they no longer had access to prescription pills.
Right.
Um, but heroin is expensive and it's hard to get. So the new phase, really starting during the pandemic around 2020, is you see this influx of synthetic opioids in the form of mostly fentanyl,
Mm-hmm.
and that is the sort of new wave, and it has come to also impact us because
Right.
fentanyl is not something that lots of Black folks are opting for, but fentanyl is being put into a lot of drugs
Mm-hmm.
to, just being laced, right? And so people think that they're, snorting powder cocaine, or they think they're doing Molly, and really you're doing fentanyl.
Right.
And fentanyl is very powerful. And so for that reason, it has a very high probability of overdose. So Black and Latino men right now are leading in overdose deaths because of fentanyl. So to answer your question, no, we cannot afford to look away from what's happening with opioids, even though what's happening regarding opioids as it impacts white folks, I don't think is our problem. I don't think that we are equipped or capable enough to try to solve the global opioid crisis. I
Right.
think
Yeah.
that we have to shore up our community, and that Black people need to be making other Black people aware that it is also our business as it relates to us.
Yeah.
So, I walk around with Narcan. Which is a life-saving drug. It's just a little nasal spray that it can interrupt an overdose if you spray it in somebody's nose that is experiencing overdose. It's free to get in pharmacies. So if and you don't have to be a drug user. You could be a person at a concert or at a party where, somebody might be doing something and you see what looks like an overdose and you could save their life. Narcan is super important for us to start talking about. It's also really important that we start talking about fentanyl test strips, which you can get at pharmacies and you can buy online. That if, listen, I'm personally afraid of drugs. As funny as I wrote this book, but I'm not a person that really has ever experimented with drugs because of what I've seen it do in my community. That said, I am for harm reduction, which is to say people should be able to do drugs safely, especially if they are dealing with substance abuse, that they should be able to do drugs safely until they can get into recovery. That at the end of the day, I want our people alive. And I don't, and I don't think it's worth risking people's lives to be anti-drug, So,
Exactly.
we got to get into, we, I think more than anybody should get serious about harm reduction.
Yeah. Now, the chapter 38 intervention. One thing I will say is chapter 38 reminded me a lot about I wouldn't call it an epidemic. It didn't reach those levels and of ecstasy in the Black community.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the South and I went to college in Georgia, and in the 2000s, ecstasy was really starting to bleed all over the Black community. And I think what happened, a lot of similarities for chapter 38 intervention, is that as a community, we all just kind of said, hey, we got to slow this down. We got to figure this out. You know what I mean? It was everywhere in rap music. The biggest rapper at the time, T.I., was talking about it so often in songs. And it started as a quote unquote white problem. And then it just started coming over into the Black community in droves. And it really affected, the Black community big time. And I would say, because we were, as 80s babies, we were the survivors of the crack epidemic, a lot of the issues started to remind us in a way of those, prior pain points that we had as a community. A lot of us on an individual level decided that this couldn't continue. And you spoke about that in chapter 38 when you're like, the crack epidemic didn't slow down just because of the government. A lot of times they like to take credit for it and say, hey, DARE solved everything. Just say no solved everything. And you're like, no, the community had to step in and had to galvanize itself. So what were some of why was it so important for you to mention that in the book? I appreciate that you did, but what kind of made it that this has to be a part of this book?
It was important because it was just what the research and the science suggested. That I had to write about the decline of the crack epidemic and to give an answer for what led to crack's decline. And all the scholars say that it was just the choices that young people made. That every generation is going to experiment with substances, and it's just the way that society is. Like, drugs are a fact of society. And the next generation of young Black and Latino folks looked at the devastation in our communities, and we said, actually, I'm good, right? That, like, I don't want to be a crackhead, basically, was what, people thought. And that is worth celebrating, because I think the people that we hardly ever celebrate are young Black people. Like,
Yeah.
And to think that something this big was ended by the choices, the sort of good choices that young Black people made, I think was worth commending. Also because it is prescriptive for how you can end future epidemics, right? Is that you have to look to, yes, dealing with the people who are going through addiction and substance abuse, but you also got to really have your eye on that next generation and make sure that they don't pick up where the other folks leave off. Drug epidemics are trends, and any trend is really about something that becomes popular in a generation of people. So whether it's bell bottoms or pet rocks or
Yeah.
8-track tapes, right? That it's not enough for one generation to be into it, that subsequent generations have to be into it. So, the way that you end an epidemic is not over policing. What you do is you change conditions for the subsequent generations. That subsequent generations have to be aware, alert, and informed to be able to make better decisions. And they also need alternatives, because it's worth saying that according to the researchers, the next generation of young Black and Latino folks, these are researchers with the US Department of Justice, called them the blunt generation. And what they said was that they were influenced by hip hop music, by films around the time to turn to marijuana. So
Right.
you see, as sort of an aside, that the year that crack use plummets in America, 1992, marijuana use takes off in America. That happens to be the year that Dr. Dre dropped the Chronic. And I think that, either Dre was representing a phenomenon, or he also was influencing the phenomenon that young people, when they came of age, didn't make crack their first drug of choice, that they used
Right.
something much safer, that actually has no potential for overdose, that you don't get withdrawal from. And I think that, whether it's Molly and ecstasy, or whether it's, fentanyl, or, whatever young people are codeine and syrup, whatever people are experimenting with, that they need to have healthy options as well.
Yep. And I saw Aaron Maven in the comments said that the term crackhead is used as a weapon, to take the humanity away from a person. And I couldn't agree more. Just that phrase was thrown around so easily
Mm-hmm.
in our era that, you can get called a crackhead for doing pretty much anything.
Yeah.
And whatever it was that you were called for doing that, you would probably stop doing that.
Right.
I remember being in, I was a senior in college, and the hookahs started getting popular.
Yeah.
I saw like 3 kids crowding around a hookah, and I was like, oh, that's crack. They freebase. I just didn't know what it was. I said, okay, there's a pipe, there's a lighter, this is crack. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. No,
Um,
I mean, yeah, like I think that is just how seared that is in our memories. I'm like, when I was in college, I knew people who wouldn't even smoke out of a bong, like wouldn't smoke weed out of a bong. They're like, I don't know, it's a little crackish. You know what I mean? And I think that just goes to show, kind of in like a silly way, but also in a serious way, how impactful that era was on us.
yeah, and it's something that, as 80s babies, we live through, and that it really affects everything that we do. And I think that now that, the crack epidemic, the direct usage era is maybe over, but now we're on the kind of the reflecting stage of it, where now we have to go back and really examine, like you said, examine the different issues that we have on a personal level that come from witnessing the devastation in our communities. And then that way we can be better equipped to, like you said, drugs are trends. So we can be better equipped for this current trend and the next trend that happens in our community, so that we can address it quicker and more effectively than the crack era was I don't want to say dealt with, but was combat it.
Yeah, you said it, man. I mean, I couldn't have put it better.
Now, when we started the interview, I asked about what was the biggest misconception about the crack epidemic. Did you have any misconceptions about the era that were kind of thwarted through your research and writing of the book?
Yeah. You know, I thought so, like, two stories. One, the story of Richard Pryor blowing himself up, freebasing, I found out was not factual. That according to his widow, Richard Pryor had attempted to actually burn himself alive using high proof rum, and that he was at the time high on freebase, but it wasn't a freebase related explosion that caused that. But at the time, he was reluctant to talk about being suicidal, so they blamed it on freebase. The other was about the death of Len Bias, who was recruited to the Celtics. He was a first NBA draft pick out of Maryland, and the night that he was drafted to the Celtics, he and his friends partied in his dorm room, and he died. He had his heart, he had a heart condition that led to his death. And the story had always been that Len Bias died because he smoked crack. And based on the amount of crack in his system and some evidence recovered there at the scene, it was, found that Len Bias actually had snorted powdered cocaine. But, Len Bias was still used, for those of us that were young men at the time, as an example of, somebody healthy with a promising career who, just one time smoking crack, died from it. His friend said that he had snorted powdered cocaine before, and that he had just used too much that night, and he had a heart condition that his family didn't know about, and it, led to him dying. I think that sort of setting the record straight on those two things, one, is just interesting to know that just how far misinformation can go.
Yeah.
So that to me is interesting, but also because those stories went towards the myth of crack as a super drug, and then ultimately the demonization of people who used and sold crack. So we got the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powdered cocaine as a direct response to Len Bias's death.
Yep.
That those senators immediately went to propose that legislation, and they just one-upped each other. How much worse should the sentence be for crack cocaine than powder? And they got to 100-to-1. It's worth pointing out that the Obama administration reduced that in 2010 to 18-to-1. But even today, knowing that crack and powdered cocaine are the same substance, we still have a sentencing disparity. And that to me just goes to show how far we still have to go when it comes to our understanding of crack.
Yeah, definitely. Now, your resume as a writer is known, right? You're a very polished journalist. Now, this was your first written book. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right.
What were some of the kind of lessons that you learned from writing a book as opposed to, or are there any kind of differences in writing a book and your previous writing experience?
Yeah. You got to keep going. For like the writers out there that, if you have experience writing sort of shorter form, it's not too different, right? That like the craft is the craft, but you will get to a point where you will fall out of love with your voice. I like to say where like, or the things that you've done in articles or in poems, in short stories where you have done them a few times in the writing of a much longer piece. And you realize that you have to develop new skills and you got to add some new tricks to your bag. And when you get to that point, let's say you're about 20,000 words in on a book that's supposed to be 100,000 words. That was the case for me. Instead of beating yourself up, take a break, read, go back to the materials that have inspired you, allow yourself to be inspired. Music music really inspired me. I listened to a lot of Kendrick Lamar and really appreciated what he was doing as a storyteller. I listened to some Beyonce and appreciated what she was doing on albums like Lemonade, and thinking about how you build a body of work like an album, and thinking of, chapters as songs on an album.
Right.
And that kind of opened up a new way of thinking about it for me. And keep in mind, something that I learned writing this book is that a book can be anything that you want it to be, that there are no rules. And that, if you want to have chapters that are 2 pages, which I have some very short chapters in the book, I have some very long chapters in the book, that's what you should do. That you have to give the book what it needs, and don't be held to any convention. And last, I would say take as long as you need to, because there were things that I learned 4 years into this book project that if I had got it done in a year, it just wouldn't be in the book.
Yeah.
So, give the book what it needs and take the time that you need.
And it's funny you mentioned about the different chapter lengths. I love that about the book, because that was, like we spoke about earlier, that was now mind you, now the whole time now.
Right.
Now let me break this down too. That it was those like moments, like you read it, the one chapter, you turn it over, it's like, okay, now mind you, Lyndon Johnson was doing this at this time, so it flowed like a conversation throughout the book.
Thanks, man. Yeah, that was and that part was fun to do. That writing the book was really hard, researching the book was really hard, but I really enjoyed structuring the book, because I realized that the history could be in conversation with the narratives, and the narratives could be in conversation with each other. And that's the way that our stories actually work, right? That none of us is an island, that we exist with all this context, and we're constantly interacting with each other. So it was fun to take somebody like Lenny, who was an addict and who had a son, and to pair her with Elgin, who was the son of an addict, and to have their stories be in conversation. In ways that maybe they never even talked to their, relatives about what was happening. They could talk to each other on the page.
Right. Now, speaking of music, I was a little jealous. I saw you at the Renaissance tour. I was a little jealous about that. But when you kind of set out to write this book, what were some of the main driving points that you said, no matter what, this has to be explained?
Yeah. I had to explain where crack came from. I had to explain why it went away. And I had to describe how it was experienced by addicts, by dealers, by politicians, and by the people who loved addicts and dealers, because we are a part of that community. And I felt like if I did that, then I would have done a service to the story. Lots of other things came up, but I was really happy to be able to answer those questions.
Okay. All right. Now, the conspiracy that I was holding on to for a long time.
I knew you were going to go there.
I was holding on to it for a long time. Which was how the recipe for cocaine to become crack was discovered in the Black community. And then as I read this book, from your amazing research, you kind of shed some more light on kind of some of the pathways that might have happened. Now, I was like, the government did it. They sent people into the Black community to teach people. We don't know how to do this stuff. They came in and they manufactured this. But your research just kind of explained the atmosphere at that time, right? That would allow such a devastating recipe to be shared and discovered. You thinking about back then, there's no social media back then. This is all word of mouth. This is all, at a table telling their crews about this, and then this goes on. Yeah. And it spoke about the power of how the power of community can be felt, right? It can be felt negatively and positively.
Yeah,
Where
absolutely.
at the table, I tell you how to cook crack. That's negative. Where at the table, I tell you how we're going to get our family member off of drugs. That's positive. So, how did how does your research lead you to kind of finding that key part of the story? And once you found it out, how did you go about deciding how to kind of put it into the book to continue the story?
Yeah. It was I wrote about the origins of crack with all of the necessary and available materials. So that was a mix of existing reporting. We have folks like Gary Webb to thank for his work in the Dark Alliance series about Rick Ross and the CIA, which he documented very well. And even though his conclusions were discredited, his argument that the CIA dropped crack into Black communities to disrupt them, that has been discredited. The evidence that he found that the CIA was aware that literal tons of crack were being trafficked into the United States, and that they knew who it was being trafficked to, and that they didn't disrupt it, right? Like, all of that's there. And all of that is documented by not just Gary Webb, but also a commission that John Kerry put together in the 90s, right? Where he found several cases of CIA connections to cocaine traffickers during the period that the federal government was criminalizing Black communities. So all of that still exists. But what I didn't find any evidence for was that the CIA created crack. The actual evidence that I found had, when I went to the West Coast, to LA and to Oakland and interviewed people, they talked about how this knowledge was sort of commonplace, right? It was moving through community networks, first among hippies, among people who were just experimenting with cocaine in the 70s. And I was able to find a doctor who had testified before Congress about how there was this rising drug, right? Freebase was becoming a thing in LA as early as the 70s, and in the Bay Area as early as the 70s. So then from that, I found a book called The Pleasures of Cocaine that was published in the late 70s by an independent publisher. And it was a very popular book, specifically in the Bay, right? Because you're talking about just a community of kind of free-loving, drug-loving people who are passing around this knowledge. And the book is being sold out of what they called head shops. So any place that you could buy, rolling papers and a bong and, stuff to clean pipes. So then I tracked down the publisher. It was that sort of just journalistic thoroughness of, you knock on every door available. So I tracked down the publisher. He had passed away, but his wife was still alive. And they co-published a lot of the work. And she talked to me about his process of getting that information. And it was from a group of Bay Area college students. They were chemistry students that were cocaine enthusiasts. And they were just having fun, trying to figure out different ways of consuming it in ways that people, it's hard to imagine, but in the ways people try to figure out different ways to consume weed today, right? So like, let's make some brownies and, what can we do with the resin? Like all of this stuff. Well, they, knew enough chemistry to know this process of freebasing, which is to separate the base of a compound from its other elements, to free the base of a compound from its other elements. Right. And that's how you make it smokable. So, powdered cocaine is not smokable. If you put it to a flame, you will destroy the drug.
Correct.
But you can mix it with chemicals and separate the base of it. And that, I probably shouldn't be telling people how to make crack on your live, but it's a process that then makes it smokable. Anything smokable goes directly to the brain and gets you high immediately, and it's an intense high, but it's short-lived. That's where crack comes from. So I got that story from her, and then in talking to people who were there at the beginning of the crack epidemic in LA, a lot of them talked about having learned it from one particular pimp. And this pimp had family in the Bay Area. And when I was able to kind of track down his story, I found out that he was in with this group of what I'm calling cocaine enthusiasts. Somebody is laughing about that in the comments, but yeah, that like he was in with those folks. And
Right.
so from that, I was able to sort of draw a trail, right, based on the oral history from these Bay Area students who then influenced, folks like this pimp that had connections in California and Los Angeles. And so you go from them to him to then street level dealers in LA. And then from there, it explodes around the country because LA had, through the Bloods and the Crips and those gangs, a distribution network where you could set up, a dealer on every corner. And, LA being a big influencer of culture, once it's there, then it gets to the rest of the country and the rest of the world.
Right. I remember, expose my age a little bit. I remember when kids were taking notes from the Master P album, Ghetto Dope.
Yeah.
In Indiana, they were like literally writing down everything that he said and learning how to cook from a rap album. So, hearing about your journalistic journey to go find, kind of really turn over every stone makes it even another full circle moment because, Master P got a lot of his base in the Bay Area. So, then he comes out with Ghetto Dope, and I know that image is kind of burned in a lot of people in our age groups brain of a drug addict. He has on a cover of a magazine. I remember being like, how can he put this on a cover of a magazine? Like, you can't, this is not allowed, is it? But it's like, this is reality. So this was his reality that he shared. So again, the book is When Crack Was King, A People's History of a Misunderstood Era, Donovan Ramsey. If you were to explain the book in one sentence, how would you try to do that? It's an amazing book. A lot of work went into it. I know it would be hard to kind of just do one sentence, but if you were forced to just do a quick kind of elevator pitch, one sentence about the book, what would it be?
I would say that When Crack Was King is a people's history of crack's rise and fall, told through the stories of 4 individuals around the country who survived it. It is, if I can add just half a sentence to it, it explains where crack came from, the impact that it had on us, but also how we harness the power of community to get over it.
No, you can't asking a writer to explain something in one sentence. I understand, so you can definitely get as many more words in as you need. When Crack Was King, how will people find and buy this book? What are the best channels for them to go through?
So the book is available everywhere books are sold. I would encourage you to buy it from an independent Black bookstore. You can go on a website like Bookshop to do that. They, source them all directly there. My favorite is For Keeps in Atlanta, but I'm also a big fan of Reparations Club in Los Angeles. If you want to get it, even faster, you can buy it from Amazon. And also, if you like audiobooks, I'm actually reading the audiobook. So check that out. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I see my man Debonair in the comments. No, you cannot get this book from me. This is my copy. Yeah, he gets some of the books from me, but this one I'm holding on to. I got notes in this one, Debonair. You don't want it. I've highlighted stuff. I've branded this book. You don't want this one. So get, as rude as it's going to sound, Debonair, I love you, but you're going to have to get your own on this one.
Yeah. That's like the like old school commercial. No, my brother. You got to get your own.
You got to get your own, brother. All over this. So, yeah, you got to get your own. I really, really appreciate you joining me here today. Are there any kind of, closing remarks that you want to say about the book?
Um, no, like I want people to certainly get it, and to also know that like the story, as like comprehensive as I tried to make it, that it doesn't stop with when crack was king. That all of us, or many of us, have stories that relate to this era, and I think that hopefully people will read the book and be inspired to explore their own stories and tell more stories, because I think that there is so much that I couldn't get to, and there's so much that we still don't know about that period of time. So if you like that book, you know, my book. If you like my book, if you don't like my book, you know, don't let it stop with just my book.
Well, I mean, hey, if somebody does not like When Crack Was King, it's either because they don't like big books or another issue.
Yeah,
Because this book is going to force you as a reader to examine your own, you know, different experiences with the drug epidemic. I'm not going to say, you know, everybody didn't partake in the drug, but everybody in the Black community has been affected by drugs, whether directly or indirectly. And it's going to force you to examine those ramifications that you went through, maybe some decisions that you made. Like I said, when you know when we would strip the humanity from people with that title of a crackhead, this makes you examine that and be honest with yourself that that was a wrong decision that you made, and to go about, you know, different ways to try to, if you can, you know, rectify that. So it's also anybody who, it's funny, I was just, when I started reading it, for some random reason, the day before, I searched on TikTok random The Wire clips. I don't know why. I'd seen the show so long ago, and I think I just saw something that made me start looking at some old Wire clips. And what I would say, I know my generation, our generation, we've all seen The Wire. This book explains everything. You know, how The Wire broke down from the corner boy to the police chief to the mayor and the businessman down the street. Everybody's connected by the drug trade. And When Crack Was King goes further than that. It goes corner boy, drug addict, mayor, president, ex-president, all the way to the creation of the drug, and expands not only Baltimore, goes New York, LA, Ohio. It encompasses everything from that era and from the era that we're going through now. And to better explain, this is a Black story. You know what I mean? The crack epidemic is intertwined in the Black story. So you have to learn it to be able to get a full picture of exactly our standing point in the world. So this is a very important book, in my opinion. As much as I brag about it, I'm not letting anybody borrow it, because this is one of those books that if you let somebody borrow, you're not going to get it back. Because once they start reading, they're going to start texting you and telling you stuff, and that's when you know, anybody who's let somebody borrow a book, they start texting you about the book like you not the one that let them borrow it. But never seeing that book again.
Absolutely.
When they start telling you, hey man, did you know this? You're like, it's my
I gave you
book.
the book, right?
You're never seeing that book again. So that's one of these books. I'm gonna completely finish reading it probably today, and I'll do another kind of in-depth review about it. But thank you, for writing this book, for the amount of personal sacrifice that you did in researching and putting the book together. You know, thank you for everything that you've done in your writing experience that led up to the book. Everything that you will do in the future. If anybody has not researched Donovan Ramsey's work previous to this book, I would very much recommend that you do that, because you have been putting on for Black people for a very long time before putting this book out. And with this book, you're just continuing on that excellent trajectory that you're on now.
Thank you, man. That means everything. That's what it's all about.
I really appreciate you. Thank you for, spending some time with us. Everybody go out, support the book When Crack Was King. Once you read it, let me know how you feel about it. Reach out to Donovan. Writers love to get feedback. So read it, do your review on Amazon, reach out, let me know how you like the book. I love it when people tell me how they like books that I suggest to them. I've only been cussed out a few times. It doesn't hurt that much. But, if you write me and you just hated the book, let me know, and we'll talk about that. But I don't think I'll get any of those messages because I think anybody who reads it's going to love it.
Thanks, man.
I really appreciate it. So I'll let you go. I know you're a busy man. So I really appreciate you for joining us today, and then hopefully we'll catch up in the future again.
Absolutely. I mean, if I can't take you on tour with me after that, I got to write another book.
Exactly. I was looking like, man, I got a floral shirt. I would have fit right in. I would fit right in. I promise.
Absolutely. All right.
I appreciate it. All right. Take care. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Peace.
Bye. That was the good brother Donovan Ramsey. Like I said, this book is an amazing book. When Crack Was King, it's a book that I would say is as close to required reading as it can get, because you got to hear about the different stories, and a lot of times, reading about on a global scale makes the individual stories that you've gone through that much more relatable to you, right? You can understand that this isn't just something that your family went through. This isn't only something that your block or your city's gone through. This is a worldwide phenomenon, especially with the crack epidemic. It's something that we as 80s babies, I say, my generation, we are so directly affected by, even if we weren't actively a member of the epidemic. We still have to, pick up the pieces, and we have to figure things out because we got our own epidemics that we're fighting against every day, and that we can learn from the crack era on how to navigate them. So pick up the book, When Crack Was King. I'll let y'all go today. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope everybody has a great Sunday. Thank you.